Okay, now that we've taken a break and let that marinate for a little while, we did skip over something we haven't talked about. We just assumed it worked.
Braille.
Which one? Braille?
Some weird symbols going on.
I was trying to figure out where you got that from. Like, all right, left field. But yeah, I see that does look kind of Braille-ish. Basically, we need to manage these free space blocks. We need to know when a block is free and when it's not free. There's different ways to go about it, although one nice thing is called a bit vector. What do you think that means?
A vector of bits.
Whoa. So if you had a byte is 8 bits, so you can actually just have a vector of a bunch of bits that basically tell you if a block is either in use or not in use. So if you want to find out if it's in use, you just go and find the index in here and you're done. If you want to find if a block is free, you just scan it for the first 0. By the way, there are instructions in pretty much every x86 processor since the 386 that will do this really fast. They'll just go through and scan and tell you the index of the first 0 in a 32-bit integer, and you can just keep doing that over and over again until you find something. So this is actually supported by hardware the way this is done. So of course, number of bits per word. Word is usually 4 bytes, so that's 32 bits. Number of 0 value words plus an offset for the first bit. All right. And then that's how you keep track. You just update this bit vector, which is usually bit vector. Where is the bit vector stored?
Hopefully in cache.
In cache, right. But where is it stored permanently?
Header control block.
Header control block. Yeah, it's somewhere in the file system. It's going to store this bit vector. So it does require extra space. The block size, let's say 2 to the 12th, the disk is 2 to the 30th, that's a gigabyte. You divide the 2 out, you only need 32 kilobytes of disk space to store the bit vector for a 1 gigabyte machine. It's actually pretty good. Easy to get contiguous files. Just find out how many zeros in a row you have available. See a link, if you were to do a linked list here, what are they talking about? Oh, a free list of all your different, instead of doing a bit vector, you would do a linked list of all these different bits. That'd kind of be jumping around too much. The last two things, not too important. Group, well, it's important, but it's really more important just keep this bit vector in mind. They'll come up with a way to basically group, they'll have a data structure that groups the number of zeros together. So if you need 10 blocks together, you can go into that data structure real quick. What is it? Oh, please, come on, tell me.
Well, I was just reading an email from Dr. Sessions, and she was like, I really like this plan thingy document, but I prefer it to be called requirements document, so please change it. Yeah.
You just need to be decisive, man. And counting, I forgot what counting was for. Probably how many blocks are free. Anyways, just keep the bitmap in mind. Need to protect the pointer to the free list. That's why the bitmap has to be kept on disk. Usually you keep a copy in memory because it's not that big, but you need to make sure that the version in memory and the one on disk are the same. Can allow for block I to have a situation where bit I equals 1 in memory and bit, so first set it in disk, allocate the block, then set it in memory. In other words, what can happen is, remember, these machines can turn off at any moment, so you want to make sure that you update it in the correct order. So if you update it on disk first, allocate it, and then set the one in memory, well, you might be losing a block, but at least you're not messing up your file system. Directory implementation, so didn't we just talk about this in the beginning?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Free space head. If you're doing the linked, this is free, this guy's free, and you just link it all about. Again, you have that problem where, well, luckily, if it's a list, you just want to take from the beginning, and then you append to maybe the end, and that's probably not too bad. But then you got to store it in each node. All right, efficiency, disk allocation. This is efficiency and performance in general. Your disk allocation directory algorithms depends on what you're keeping. Type of data kept in files and write performance. Almost every disk has a cache on it. You can go and look. They'll even tell you how big the disk cache is. Well, either it's on disk, but here they're talking about something in main memory for frequently used blocks. So maybe it doesn't need to actually write anything if your file doesn't last very long. Free behind and read ahead techniques, yeah, for anything that's sequential. What's important to keep in mind is that if you know your program is going to read a bunch of data, the operating system can at least start queuing up the disk reads so that everything will get bursted into memory for you. All right, page cache. You knew caching was coming in, right, Matt? Yeah. So the page cache will cache pages rather than disk blocks using the virtual memory. So this is keep it a little different, but it's a little different, but you are still caching what's on the disk. You're just looking at it via pages. This is how memory mapped I/O uses a page cache in order to do your I/O. Routine I/O through the file system uses the buffer disk. This leads to, okay, sure. Give me
Is this talking about like the hardware cache?
This is your cache in main memory. File system, your buffer cache that's in your main memory. I/O using read or write, or may store a page cache, which is where your mapped I/O is. It's a little hard to see why. Well, they're separated because this one's caching the pages, which is the way the operating system looks at it and presents memory to your program. The buffer cache is the general cache on top of the file system, which is where your I/O reads and writes to. So that's why they're separate in this picture. Of course, being separate is is ridiculous because you have this extra step right here. So that's why this is called an ununified buffer cache. But the unified buffer cache, both memory mapped I/O and I/O read write go to the same buffer cache. The point here is that keep in mind that the memory presented to a user is pages, and then the disk has its own system using blocks that come from the disk. Memory mapped I/O is trying to combine the two, and that's why you would have a page cache, but then you can unify it to have buffer cache when you're doing I/O. All right, lastly, recovery. Very important. When systems go down, you want to be able to recover your data or hopefully a lost file on a disk by somehow restoring it. The most common way to do that nowadays is called logging, or log structure, or journaling, as I call it. This came out with ext3, which was really just ext2 plus journaling.
Fancy.
I know. Whoa. All transactions are first written to a log. It's considered committed once the log has received your transaction and that has been written to the disk. Your file system may not be updated yet, but what you wanted to write to the file system has been recorded. That includes where you're writing or what you're deleting or adding and the data itself. Later on, the transactions in the log are asynchronously written to the file system. So while your computer may be doing something else, in the background, your hard drive is then hopefully committing these logs. When the file system modified, the transaction is removed from the log. aka once the file system is done, then it removes the transaction from the log. If the file system crashes before a transaction has been committed, then the log must first be performed before the file system will come up. And you've probably seen this a lot when something crashes, like, hold on, we got to fix your file system. Sometimes they're scanning the whole file system, other times they're just replaying the log, depending on which file system you're using. And that's what's going on here. Everyone understand that? Very important, pretty much. That doesn't use this, but ext3 and above use it. NTFS has something similar to this. Any modern file system uses logging, or journaling, sorry, journaling. NFS, did we talk about NFS? I thought we did.
Yeah, last Tuesday.
All right, so Solaris or Sun came out with this. Just communicate over UDP and Ethernet. The idea is that every machine is both a client and a server, and that they may, if they store a file, they can act as the server so other people can access it. All right, here, picture. I think it's far better with here. Let's say you have 3 different machines, U, S1, and S2, and they're mounted in the following manner. Each triangle represents a partition on the disk. Of course, there's the root partition, and then local has its own partition in gray. S1, it's shared, has its own partition, and then directory 1 has its own partition, and then S2, directory 2 is its own partition. Okay? The idea is that U, which didn't have directory 1, could mount directory 1 from S1. So it could say I'm going to mount directory 1 right here, in which case it would look something like this, and that's called mounting. Cascading mounts, just to make it clear, is that if this is mounted and then he wants to mount something on top of it, he can. When something's mounted on top of, it's going to use that mount until you finally unmount it, and then it'll fall back. All right. NFS uses RPC, remote procedure call, to forward all the communication, as well as an export list to specify the file system that the server exports for mounting. All right. It just has to conform to the export list when it's serving up the network file system. But the idea here is it's establishing a connection between a server, which could be anyone, and a client, which could be anyone else. Right, Matt? Mm-hmm. Totally. NFS, at least before version 4, is stateless, which is nice, and then each request has to provide a full set of arguments. That means that if you don't really have to do journaling so much because you always have the full transaction. And NFS doesn't have concurrency control, it just says we pretend that that doesn't exist. AKA, if what could be a race condition here?
If 2 thingies try and mount something at the same time.
That's fine that they both have it mounted.
Try and modify it at the same time?
Yeah, what if they both try and modify at the same time?
In words.
Yeah, words.
Yeah.
So if they both are trying to write at the same time, the server has to figure out what to do from there. And NFS just doesn't, it ignores the problem. It doesn't exist. 3 layers, so you might have your Unix, your virtual, and then NFS. Okay, that's fine. Here we go. This is probably the biggest picture. So on the server is the actual file system, the client system call VHS, VFS, sorry, VHS. The client RDPC over the network receives it back on the other server machine, goes to the NFS server, reads it off the disk, and then can send it back. So here's the full stack. Well, maybe not the full stack, but the idea of the stack that's occurring. You good, Matt? All right. Path names usually broken up into components to figure out which machine to go to. Wow, there's a lot here.
That's too many words.
It really is. NFS was specifically made so that it could mirror Unix. That's really what this comes down to. And NFS tries to constantly update itself with the remote server. That's really the 2 things you need to keep in mind here. Then there's the waffle file system, which I thought was a great name. Write anywhere file layout. All this is actually doing is this kind of a meta file system where you have one file system and then it translates into NFS, CIFS, aka Windows Share, or you could do it over HTTP or FTP. It's just a way to standard interface to interact with other ones. All right, that's great. That's all that matters here, and that's end of chapter 11. Good. We don't need to go too much into this. Any questions? Do you like waffles?
Oh yeah, I actually do have a question.
What's your
related to that? So if you have a bridge with a mystical bridge wizard and you have a car coming from the left and the right at the same time, what do you do? Because I forgot to answer that part of the question
This is out of
from that one homework. If you have two cars trying to go the one-lane bridge at the same time,
You need to have a mechanism that stops the cars from getting on the bridge until they're given permission.
cool. And then just pick one of the two.
Yeah, and then allow it to go through. Good question. Any other questions? Chris? Tyler?
Why did they get rid of the printer in here?
No, it's right up there. It's just not connected. Actually, it's powered on, but does it even have a network cable? Oh, it does. Wow.
I have no network cable though.
Oh! All right. Well, good talk, guys. Have a good fall break.